Hi. Guess what? We're still not done with intervals, but we're getting there. We're close. We're so close. So we've talked about intervals from a major scale sense, where you remember that in any major scale, you can like derive all your intervals if you can remember that a major scale has whole, half, whole, half as far as the steps or seconds between each note. And you can remember that from the tonic of the scale, the do, every single interval is a major interval or a perfect interval. So you got a major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth to la, major seventh to ti, perfect octave to do. Do, do, perfect unison to itself, do, re, major second, do, mi, major third, do, fa, perfect fourth, do, sol, perfect fifth, do, la, major sixth, do, ti, major seventh, do, do, perfect octave. Remember, we don't say eighth, we say octave. Except I probably say eighth on accident like once a week when I'm teaching. It's okay if you do too, I guess. We also talked about how all these intervals you can think of, if you're more in a guitar frame of mind, in terms of like the number of half steps from 0 to 12. So in an octave, there are 12 total half steps. 12 frets on a guitar to get back to the note you started on, the pitch class you started on. 12 notes, including white and black keys on a piano to get back to where you started. And if you go 0, you got a perfect unison. And if you go 2, you got a major second. And if you go 4, you got a major third. And if you go 5, you got a perfect fourth. And if you go 7, you got a perfect fifth. And if you go 9, you got a major sixth. Oh my God, there's no such thing as a perfect sixth. And if you go 11, you got a major seventh. And if you go 12, you're back to a perfect octave. And this way you can remember, like, 1 less than a major second is a minor second, or 1 less than a major third is a minor third. 1 less than a perfect fifth is a diminished fifth, or 1 more than a perfect fourth is an augmented fourth. 1 more than a perfect fifth is an augmented fifth, but this could also be a minor sixth. This major sixth, I'm not going to lie to you, sometimes it's a diminished seventh. 10 half steps is a minor seventh usually, but sometimes it's an augmented sixth. And the difference between these is how you spell them, right? If we're in the key of C, then a augmented fourth would be the F sharp, but a diminished fifth would be G flat, because C, D, E, F, that's 4. C, D, E, F, G, that's 5, right? So I'll review, so if this sounds unfamiliar to you, go rewatch the last couple episodes. And finally, when we're talking about raising or lowering intervals, we talked about how some intervals can be perfect, that is your unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves. And if you raise them, they're augmented, and if you lower them, they're diminished. And then we talked about how the other intervals, seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths, can still be diminished, but they can't be perfect, because they have 2 consonant versions, right? Every note you have that is consonant is perfect or major and minor. Anything that isn't one of these 3 is not consonant. And then there's one dicey, weird one, and that's your fourth. The reasons why the fourth counts as dissonant are because of our music theory definitions of consonants and dissonance, which has to do with their behavior instead of how they sound. Fourth sounds consonant in certain contexts, and so you can't just go by the sound, and that's what we talked about last time. So we have a couple things left that I want to talk about today. These are intervals bigger than an octave. I'm sure you wondered, anytime I did this, you're like, well, what if you have an interval bigger than an octave? And that happens. And we call them compound intervals. And guess what? We call intervals that are an octave or less simple intervals, greater than an octave, compound intervals. You might recognize these words. They get used a lot in music theory. They get used for time signatures. Simple time subdivides, or rather, divides the beats into twos. Compound time divides the beats into threes. Totally separate, totally different. In fact, in the world of time and in the world of meter, I don't understand why they use the word simple and compound. It doesn't really make sense to me. But in the world of intervals, these words do make sense. Compound is like a simple interval plus more. And so that's how we think of compound intervals. They're like an octave plus whatever. And most compound intervals can have more than one name, but we don't use them all. So like we said, we call a unison a unison. Yeah, we call a unison a unison. It's weird, right? We have our second. We have our third. These are all intervals and sizes of intervals, and they can be major or minor or whatever. And we get to an octave, and say we go once more. You might think it's called a ninth, and you're not wrong. It is a ninth. And we can go to a 10th, and an 11th, and a 12th, and a 13th, and a 14th, and a 15th. But once you get down to the 15th, you're way beyond what people are usually going to call by these names. Instead, usually people take these simple intervals and reuse these names for compound intervals. So a ninth, they would call a compound second, because it's just like a second, only it's taller, right? Like if we were going around the circle in our C major scale and we made it an octave, then going from the octave to the ninth is just like going from the root to the second. So it's something about it that's the same. In the same way, C3 sounds like C4. So in the same way, octaves sound equivalent in some way to our ears. Intervals that are an octave apart sound similar to our ears. A ninth strikes our ear a lot like a second does. A 10th strikes our ear a lot like a third does. 11th like a fourth. 12th like a fifth. 13th like a sixth. 14th like a seventh. 15th like an octave. And in fact, a 15th is just called a double octave a lot of times. You can use the word compound in any of these to name these kind of intervals. So you could say a compound major sixth, and that would be the same thing as saying a major 13th. Like I said, no one really talks about any compound intervals higher than this 15th. 15th is a double octave, and you kind of need to know that number because sometimes when music goes really high up into the ledger lines, maybe you're familiar with this, but like if the notes get way high up and it's hard to read, sometimes they'll write them an octave below and put a little line over it that says 8 VA, which means octava, like play it an octave higher. But when they get super duper duper high, sometimes you'll see a line that says 15 VA. It's always confusing when you're first learning music because you're like, okay, if an octave is 8, then a double octave should be 16, right? But remember, we're dealing with a kind of math that starts with 1 instead of 0. So yet more fallout from the weird math choices of early music theorists is why a 15th above a note sounds just like an octave above a note. Weird, right? So yeah, that's compound intervals. Pretty simple. In context, it makes sense sometimes to call them by their real names. More often, it makes sense to call them by these names. And nobody calls anything its real name after the 15th. So don't worry about learning this. One last thing about intervals, and then I think we're done with intervals, at least for now, and that is interval inversion. Now, here's a new vocab word that's going to come up a lot. Inversion. Inversion can mean a lot of different things in music theory. And this is, I guess, the first one we're going to learn about. And the idea of interval inversion is kind of like this. Like, let's take an interval. Let's take the interval C to E. We'd call this a major third. If we're in the key of C, that'd be like do, mi. Well, if we want to invert that interval, what it means is we take one of the notes and move it an octave. So we take the C, let's take the C and move it up an octave. And now instead of a major third, do, mi, we have a minor sixth. Mi, do, do, mi, do, right? And you can do it with any interval. Say we take a perfect fifth, do, sol. Well, if we invert that, move this C up an octave. Now we have, instead of do, sol, perfect fifth, we have sol, do, perfect fourth. It also works if we do it the other way around. If we move the G down an octave, we have do, sol, do, sol. Still going to be a perfect fourth. So when we invert an interval, we just swap one of the notes in octave. It doesn't even matter which. And there's something you might notice. Look, 6 plus 3 is 9. 5 plus 4 is 9. Yeah, anytime you invert an interval, it's going to add up to 9, as long as you're naming them by their simple names. This even works for an octave, right? If you have a unison and you pop one up, you went from a perfect one to a perfect octave, even that adds up to 9. So there's this kind of nice little rainbow thing people usually draw when they're talking about inversion, where fourths invert into fifths, thirds invert into sixths, seconds invert into sevenths, unisons invert into octaves. It's a beautiful, beautiful rainbow. And I don't know why I'm even writing this down. I don't like it, but a lot of books call it the rule of 9. I mean, it's not a rule. I don't know, I'm crossing it out. To me, this is just the exact same concept as complementary or supplementary degrees in geometry. Remember that stuff? So like if you have an angle of like, I don't know, let's say this was 40 degrees, then you would know that this angle was 50 degrees. You would know this angle is 50 degrees because you know that these angles are complementary because you know that this is a right angle, if I would have told you it was a right angle. Or supplementary degrees add up to 180, right? So if you have, say, a 60 degree angle, then you still need a 120 degree angle to add up to a full 180 degrees. It's just like that with interval inversion. It's what the remainder is to add up to an octave. If you want a third, then the inversion of that third is going to be the remainder to make up the octave because you pop the one up to an 8. See what I mean? And then there's 2 more pyramids you can draw. When you're talking about seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths, major intervals convert into minor intervals. Invert. And diminished intervals invert to augmented intervals. So like a diminished fifth inverts to an augmented fourth. Right? A minor sixth turns into a major third. With unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves, I shouldn't have wrote those there. A diminished seventh inverts into an augmented second. See, 7 plus 2 is 9. Diminished goes to augmented. Diminished goes to augmented also with perfect intervals, and perfect goes to itself. So a perfect fourth inverts to a perfect fifth, but a diminished fourth inverts to a augmented fifth. Cool, right? And an augmented fifth converts to a diminished fourth. That sounds weird. And a diminished fifth converts to an augmented fourth. That's more normal. You'll see that all the time. So just if you can remember these rainbows, or if this geometry metaphor makes more sense, think of it that way. Doesn't really matter. Or last resort, rule of 9. I know I crossed it out. But it's kind of a dumb way to remember it because it has nothing to do with the actual conceptual reason why it adds up to 9. It's good if you just want to have a reason to memorize it, but that's probably not why you're listening to these videos. If you are, and if you're listening to these videos, this is the best way to think about it conceptually. What adds up to an octave? And then all this stuff kind of automatically follows from it. And then there was compound intervals, and then we're done with intervals. We'll get to triads next, chords. It's going to be fun. I'll see you then. Goodbye.